The Planet of Doubt by Stanley Weinbaum. Chapter 1. Hamilton Hammond started nervously as the voice of Cullen, the expedition's chemist, sounded from his station aft. "I see something," he called. Ham bent over the floorport, staring into the eternal green-gray fog that blankets Uranus. He glanced hastily at the dial of the electric plumb. 55 feet, it said, with an air of positiveness, but that was a lie, for it had registered that same figure for 160 miles of creeping descent. The fog itself reflected the beam. The barometer showed 86.2 centimeters. That, too, was an unreliable guide, but better than the plumb, for the intrepid Young, 4 decades earlier, in 2060, had noted an atmospheric pressure of 86 in his romantic dash from Titan to the cloudy planet's southern pole. But the Gia was dropping now at the opposite pole, 45,000 miles from Young's landing, and no one knew what vast hollows or peaks might render his figures utterly useless. "I see nothing," Ham muttered. "Nor I," said Patricia Hammond, his wife, or more officially, biologist of the Smithsonian's Gia expedition. "Or, yes, something moved." She peered closer. "Up, up!" she screamed. "Put up!" Harbord was a good astrogator. He asked no questions, nor even took his glance from his controls. He simply slapped the throttle. The underjets roared in crescendo, and the upward thrust pressed all of them hard against the floor. Barely in time, a vast gray wave of water rushed smoothly below the port, so close that its crest was carved by the blast, and spray clouded the glass. "Whew!" whistled Ham. "That was close. Too close. If we'd touched that, it would have cracked our jets for sure. They're white hot." "Ocean," said Patricia disgustedly. "Young reported land." "Yeah, 45,000 miles away. For all we know, this sea is broader than the whole surface of the earth." She considered this, frowning. "Do you suppose," she asked, "that this fog goes right down to the surface everywhere?" "Young says so." "But on Venus, the clouds form only at the junction of the upper winds and the underwind." "Yes, but Venus is closer to the sun. The heat here is evenly distributed because the sun accounts for practically none of it. Most of the surface heat seeps through from within, as it does on Saturn and Jupiter, only since Uranus is smaller, it's also cooler. It's cool enough to have a solid crust instead of being molten like the larger planets, but it's considerably colder than the Venusian twilight zone." "But," she objected, "Titan is as cold as a dozen Nova Zemblas, yet it's one perpetual hurricane." He grinned. "Trying to trip me? It isn't absolute temperature that causes wind. It's difference in temperature between one place and another. Titan has one side warmed by Saturn, but here the warmth is even, or practically even, all around the planet, since it comes from within." He glanced suddenly at Harbord. "What are we waiting for?" he asked. "For you," grunted the astrogator. "You're in command now. I command until we sight the surface, and we've just done that." "By golly, that's right!" exclaimed Ham in a satisfied voice. On his last expedition, that to the night side of Venus, he had been technically under Patricia's orders, and the reversal pleased him. "And now," he said severely, "if the biologist will kindly step aside." Patricia sniffed. "So you can pilot us, I suppose. I'll bet you haven't a single idea." "But I have." He turned to Harbord. "Southeast," he ordered, and the afterjets added their voices to the roar of the others. "Put up to 30,000 meters," he continued. "We might run into mountains." The Gia, named for the ancient goddess of Earth, who was wife to the god Uranus, plunged through the infinity of mist away from the planet's pole. In one respect, that pole is unique among the Sun's family, for Uranus revolves, not like Jupiter or Saturn or Mars or the Earth, in a manner of a spinning top, but more with the motion of a rolling ball. Its poles are in the plane of its orbit, so that at one point its southern pole faces the sun, while 42 years later, halfway around the vast orbit, the opposite pole is sunward. 4 decades earlier, Young had touched at the southern pole. It would be another 40 years before that pole again saw noon. "The trouble with women," grumbled Harbord, "is that they ask too many questions." Patricia spun on him. "Schopenhauer," she hissed, "you ought to be grateful that Patrick Burlingham's daughter is lending her aid to a Yankee expedition." "Yeah? Why Schopenhauer?" "He was a woman-hater, wasn't he? Like you." "Then he was a greater philosopher than I thought," grunted Harbord. "Anyway," she retorted acidly, "a couple of $1 million is a lot of money to pay for a square mile of foggy desert. You won't hog this planet the way you tried to hog Venus." She was referring, of course, to the Council of Barons' decision of 2059 that the simple fact of an explorer's landing on a planet did not give his nation possession of the entire planet, but only of the portion actually explored. On fog-wrapped Uranus, that portion would be small indeed. "Never mind," put in Ham. "No other nation will argue if America claims the whole fog ball, because no other nation has a base near enough to get here." That was true. By virtue of its possession of Saturn's only habitable moon, Titan, the United States was the only nation that could send an exploratory rocket to Uranus. A direct flight from the Earth is out of the question, since the nearest approach to the 2 planets is 1.7 billion miles. The flight is made in 2 jumps, first to Titan, then to Uranus. But this condition limits the frequency of the visits enormously, for though Saturn and Earth are in conjunction at intervals of a little over a year, Uranus and Saturn are in conjunction only once in about 40 years. Only at these times is it possible to reach the vast, mysterious, fog-shrouded planet. So inconceivably remote is Uranus that the distance to its neighbor, Saturn, is actually greater than the total distance from Saturn to Jupiter, from Jupiter to the asteroids, from these to Mars, and from Mars to the Earth. It is a wild, alien, mystery-cloaked planet with only icy Neptune and Pluto between it and the interstellar void. Patricia whirled on Ham. "You!" she snapped. "Southeast, eh? Why southeast? Just a guess, isn't it? Truthfully, isn't it?" "Nope," he grinned. "I have my reasons. I'm trying to save whatever time I can, because our stay here is limited if we don't want to be marooned for 40 years until the next conjunction." "But why southeast?" "I'll tell you. Did you ever look at a globe of the Earth, Pat? Then maybe you've noticed that all continents, all large islands, and all important peninsulas are narrowed to points toward the south. In other words, the northern hemisphere is more favorable for land formation, and as a matter of fact, by far the greater part of the Earth's land is north of the equator. The Arctic Ocean is nearly surrounded by a ring of land, but the Antarctic's wide open, and the same thing is true of Mars, assuming that the dark, swampy plains are old ocean beds, and also true of the frozen oceans on the night side of Venus. So I assume that if all planets had a common origin, and all of them solidified under the same conditions, Uranus must have the same sort of land distribution. What Young found was the land that corresponds to our Antarctica. What I'm looking for is the land that ought to surround this North Polar Sea." "Ought to, but maybe doesn't," retorted Pat. "Anyway, why southeast instead of due south?" "Because that direction describes a spiral and lessens the chance of our striking some strait or channel between lands. With the visibility of about 50 feet, it wouldn't take a very wide channel to make us think we were over ocean. Even your English Thames would look like the Pacific in this sort of fog if we happened to come down more than 100 feet from either bank." "And I suppose your American Mississippi would look like Noah's flood," said the girl, and fell to gazing at the gray waste of fog that swirled endlessly past the ports.